Putin is now preparing 50,000 North Korean and Russian soldiers to take back the territory that Ukraine has captured in Kursk. Hopefully, this attack goes better than the last time when Putin ordered his troops to take back the region by October 1st, but the date came and went and nothing was taken back. Ukrainian forces inside Russia defeated any Russian counterattacks with ease, and Putin just continued doing what he always does. Blame the West for Russia becoming the first nuclear country in the history to be invaded, Putin to become the first Russian leader since World War II to lose Russian territory, and oh, how can we forget, Putin is also the first sitting president in the world to have an arrest warrant against him by the International Court of Justice.
Apparently, the enemy, with the help of its Western masters, is carrying out their will, and with the hands of Ukrainians, the West is at war with us. So apparently, the enemy is striving to improve its negotiating positions in the future. And on this, there is already a response from the citizens of Russia. This is unanimous support for all who have fallen into trouble, support for the army, and an increase, which is very important, an increase in the number of those wishing to join our men, the fighters who heroically, with weapons in hand, defend Russia.
Now that clip was soon after the Kursk counteroffensive by Ukraine, but the blaming hasn't stopped. All the while Putin is blaming the West, the Russian people are blaming Putin. In fact, all the people who had to be evacuated from Kursk region are protesting. So let's get into all that and more in today's video. Like always, be sure to hit the like button down below because it helps us out tremendously in the algorithm when making these videos that YouTube is not a fan of. Now, of course, there are many people, in fact, pro-Ukrainian people who criticize Zelensky's decision to attack Russia and go inside Russia and take in territory. Their argument is mainly based around the fact that those resources and those soldiers could have been better used just fighting off Russian advances in Ukraine and on the front lines. Now, if you've been watching our videos, you already know my thoughts on this, but here's Ben Hodges' thinking behind why this was such a good idea that he shared on our podcast.
Even inside Ukraine, people are saying, "Oh, why did you do this? You could have used those troops in the east." But I thought it was a brilliant move to change the narrative a little bit. It showed that Russian victory is not inevitable, that the Russians can be defeated. And I was impressed with how the Ukrainians managed to get such a large force right on the Russian border without being compromised or detected. And so I don't know how long they'll stay where they are, but they've carved out a fairly significant bridgehead inside the Kursk region. It does create some interesting options for the Ukrainians, both in terms of if it gets to negotiations and who gets to keep what. Ukraine now sits on an important piece of Russian territory. This also creates, I think, a domestic political dilemma for the Kremlin, because I do think that some of the oligarchs, some of the people around him are saying, what the heck is going on here? We can't just let the Ukrainians sit there and occupy Russian territory. Now, they'll move at their own pace of if they decide to finally try and eliminate this bridgehead, but so far they've not been able to do it to any great effect. At the same time, I think one of the objectives for the Ukrainians, and this is only my speculation, was that it would draw off some of the Russian troops that were involved in operations in the east against Pokrovsk and Vuhledar and places like that. I can't tell yet. It's not entirely clear to me that they have drawn off a lot of forces or how much it's diverted. But I have spoken recently to a Ukrainian officer, and he said it feels different in the east. He said you can tell that the Russians are exhausted as well. They don't have the same intensity of these attacks. There's a lot of them, don't get me wrong, but it doesn't have the same sort of intensity. And actually, Russian artillery ammunition, the advantage that they had is not what it was even a few months ago.
Now, after the October 1st deadline didn't work, the deadline was moved to October 15. Well, that didn't work either. The Russian forces were not able to recapture the Russian territory, so the deadline was moved again to February 1st, 2025. I don't know about you guys, but I'm starting to feel like they have a different definition of deadlines in Russia than over here. But anyways, now it seems the Russians are trying to take back that territory again with the help of North Koreans. New reports do show there are around 50,000 soldiers, both North Koreans and Russians, preparing to go into Kursk. But before we cover that, apparently the people who were displaced because of this Ukrainian counteroffensive, they are a little mad and they are protesting against the Russian government. Here's a short clip and then we'll get into more details.
Speak here. Why would I go to your basement? Don't suggest that to us. Stand before these people who came here and explain everything right here. Why would we go somewhere? We don't care where to freeze, whether inside or outside. We don't care. We have no homes. We are not going anywhere. We'll stay here.
So according to reports, these are the refugees who fled their homes after Ukraine came into Russia. Another important thing to point out, the story that we actually saw from Ukrainian soldiers who went into Russia was the fact that many Russian citizens thought they were from NATO. And it's no surprise because in Russia, they are really framing this war as NATO is attacking Russia. And the propaganda is working. Even though the war is going horribly bad for Putin, the Russian economy is struggling, and if war ever stops, it's probably going to collapse because only thing that's holding up whatever little economic growth they do have is because of the war spending. But even after all this, the approval ratings are pretty high for Putin because he controls the media, he controls propaganda, and he's framing this as Russian war against the West. But anyways, coming back to the protest. So it's been 3 months since these people have been displaced and they're complaining that they still haven't been compensated for their loss of housing or given temporary suitable accommodations. On top of this, this is in fact a second protest within days. Just a few days ago, there was another rally from Kursk refugees who were complaining about the accommodation that they were getting after they lost their housing. We'll definitely keep you guys updated on this situation as it moves forward. Moving on to the 50,000 troops that are preparing to go into Kursk. In fact, this is a report that has been confirmed by US officials, so it's not just Ukrainians that are sharing this information. US assessment in fact concludes that Russia has been able to gather this force without having to pull any soldiers out of the front lines. Now, it's important to note that soon after the attack into Russia, Ukrainian forces gave up on capturing more ground and in fact started building defensive infrastructure to defend their positions, the territory that they had captured. That means that Ukrainians are going to be in defensive posture. That would make it harder for Russians to take back ground, which means Russians and North Koreans, I guess, will suffer heavy losses, but I guess that's something they're probably fine with. Just looking at the front lines in the Ukraine, Russia is losing on average 1,200 soldiers a day. So it's not like Russia is not okay with losing soldiers. Based on public information, which is not super reliable, but it's estimated that Ukraine has around 20,000 soldiers inside the territory that it controls in Russia. So the odds are going to be roughly 2.5 to 1, which should be relatively defensible. And that's not something me saying just off top of my head. American officials believe that Ukrainian troops will prove difficult to dislodge and that Russian and North Korean forces will probably take heavy losses, similar to what Russia suffered in eastern Ukraine. On top of that, New York Times reports the North Korean soldiers will be fighting as light infantry without the benefit of armored vehicles, and current Ukrainian tactics of artillery fire and drone attacks have proved devastating to unprotected Russian troops. And of course, as always, we'll keep you guys updated as this battle progresses. Now let's get into our coverage of the Kursk counteroffensive that happened roughly 3 months ago. But before that, YouTube is still not a fan of a lot of topics we cover, and that means the videos get restricted and demonetized. That's why we recently launched memberships and Patreons. This way you guys can support the content we make directly if you're able to. Because we want to continue covering this type of topics even if advertisers don't like it. We like doing it and hopefully you guys like watching it. That's why Patreon and memberships give us a way to continue doing this without worrying about YouTube demonetizing our videos. So if you're interested and you're able to support us, you can do so by joining our Patreon or becoming a member on YouTube. The QR codes will be on the screen and the links in the description. Your support is greatly appreciated.
People in Russia are panicking. The Russian authorities didn't warn them on time about the Ukrainian attack and have continued to downplay the situation to protect themselves. Putin is lying to his own people in an attempt to stay in power. Residents in the Kursk region and other regions bordering Ukraine are forced to pack their bags and leave. What shocked them the most was just how incompetent their government really is. I mean, just hear it for yourself.
They had to save themselves. These creatures from the administration are lying. They give themselves medals while people escape with their lives only because they saved themselves. Save yourself while you can. Television is just lies, 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 and more lies.
Meanwhile, Ukrainian troops are rolling over the border and capturing dozens of towns and cities. This invasion is a turning point in the war, not just in a strategic sense, but also for Putin's political reputation at home. What we're seeing right now could be the biggest blunder of his whole career. He has disappointed and endangered the people that should be the most important to him, namely Russian citizens. So let's look at the Russian public's reaction to the current situation, and how Putin is lying to his own people in an attempt to keep in power. But first, let's talk about something extremely important that Putin is doing right now. Now, it might be hard to believe, but YouTube was one of the few Western websites that was not banned in Russia after Putin started his quote-unquote military operation. That is to say, it was one of the few sources of unbiased information that Russians had to find out what was actually going on in the war. But guess what? YouTube was just banned in Russia this very month, along with the messaging app Signal. Now, it's not just in Russia that Putin tries to control critical news. Even here in the USA, Putin's bots are constantly disliking and downvoting videos that are exposing Putin's incompetence. That's why I have a small request. That you guys take a second and hit the like button below to help me fight the bots. Your support is greatly appreciated. The last video we made about the situation in Russia just blew up on YouTube because you guys helped us out a ton with the algorithm. Seriously, thank you for that. Alright, now let's start. We have to first look at the facts, just so that we all understand how bad the situation really is in Kursk right now. At the time of making this video, over 122,000 Russians have fled from the border areas. And that's according to Russian state media, who desperately try to keep downplaying the situation. Other news reports from a few days back were talking about 200,000 people leaving the region. The current number of displaced citizens, it could be even higher. The total population in the Kursk Oblast is 1.2 million, so this is no exaggeration. People in the neighboring Belgorod region are also being evacuated because of Ukraine's attacks and suspicious activity near the border. Outside the displaced people, the human cost is even bigger. All of these Russian refugees need to be cared for, as they need shelter and food. This places a heavy burden on tens of thousands of Russians in neighboring areas. For Putin, this whole situation is more than unfortunate. The citizens who are impacted by the invasion are understandably angry or disappointed in him. The worst criticism is that the population in Kursk wasn't warned properly. Of course, they knew that they were living near the border with Ukraine, which is always a risk during wartime. Still, it was a huge surprise when the Ukrainians actually crossed the border. People in Kursk thought they were protected by the Russian army and their two defensive lines. It was a shock to learn that the Ukrainian forces could break through this within a day. What made it even worse is how late the Russian government admitted the attack and the true scale of it. There were air sirens in the region, but that didn't alarm everyone, as it happens pretty often. On TV, the Ukrainian attack was reported as a small incursion with an attacking force of 300 men. The news channels claimed that there were only temporary problems at the border. Cross-border raids had happened before, so Kursk residents assumed it was nothing to worry about. People only realized that things were going sideways when the Russian military came knocking at their door. Suddenly, they were told that they needed to be evacuated immediately. Some needed little persuasion because they had heard loud shelling and bombing from nearby rapidly advancing Ukrainians. Others had to be convinced by the soldiers that the Nazis and the Polish mercenaries were coming. But afterwards, locals have blamed the Russian government for downplaying the Ukrainian attack and misinforming the Russian population. Citizens are also calling out Putin's government's lies on national television. Watch it here for yourself.
Our neighbors and friends helped with the escape. There was no evacuation, and there still isn't. Neighbors, whoever could, left, but of course, with their own cars. In the city itself, many people went missing without any news. There is neither communication nor electricity. What our governors write, that they are evacuating people by buses, this is not true. Yesterday, I was in the Bolsha-Slodak region, which is still fairly okay. This is the only place where you could buy food and water, because here no one provides supplies. Yesterday, the soldiers said that Martunovka is no longer ours. My children are in Kursk. We also don't know what the situation is. We don't know because they are constantly lying to us. But if soldiers came yesterday and said that there are already Ukrainians in Martunovka, while the authorities say that everything is fine, then nothing is fine.
It was not a small incursion nor a temporary problem, and the Russian military probably realized this in the first few hours. However, the Russian government refused to tell this to the people in Kursk, which was the first of many failures. Another common complaint was that the authorities didn't help everyone to escape. Most people had to flee by themselves, using their own cars. They didn't trust the situation for one bit, and decided not to wait until the Russian government would finally come to the rescue. After they left, there was also no basic necessities provided for them. But they could have made the right decision. Some villages have reportedly not been evacuated at all, which could mean that several Russian citizens are now in Ukrainian hands. In an attempt to regain some goodwill, Putin has offered around $115 to each displaced Kursk resident. This money is worth more in Russia in nominal terms, as it's equivalent to 10,000 rubles to be exact, but it's still a laughable amount for having to flee your home and risk losing everything. One commenter on Russian social media said it's absurd, as it's barely enough to buy a tent. Others said it can only pay for groceries and essentials for a few days. So the situation with the refugees is disastrous. Russian authorities still tried to downplay the situation so that people in the rest of the country would stay in the dark, although really that didn't work for very long. The people in Kursk have probably told their family members and contacts from all over the country what's really happening on the ground. Stories like these spread very quickly, and hundreds of thousands, if not millions of Russians will have heard them by now. Also, through social media posts, people in every Russian city have been informed on how bad the situation really is. Younger generations, in particular, get their information mostly from internet sources. It's not that social media is a place of free and open discussion in Russia. On the contrary, Facebook and Twitter have been banned since 2022. There's also a scary government agency called the Roskomnadzor, who censor the remaining platforms. On August 8th, just 2 days after the Ukrainian attack started, it decided to completely block YouTube. This was to prevent the spread of videos that would hurt the Kremlin's narrative. The day afterwards, the popular messenger app Signal was blocked because it enabled private communications that the Russian government can't control. But as totalitarian as the Russian government has become, it can't fully prevent the massive amounts of video evidence and personal stories from leaking to the public. As long as there's the internet, people will find a way to share these things, and Russian bots can't take everything down at once. The footage that's coming out is pretty shocking, to say the least. But before we get into that, I quickly want to answer a question that I've recently been asked. A lot of you guys want to start a YouTube channel, but you are camera shy or just not comfortable putting your face out there. In fact, I'm one of these people, and that's why this channel has no face on it. Luckily, you can still grow on YouTube even without showing your face or giving up your privacy, and this channel is living proof for that. We recently crossed 1 million subscribers, and along the way, I've learned a few tips and tricks about YouTube that can be helpful to any of you who want to start your own channel. I've included all this in my completely free 7-day YouTube crash course. So if you're someone who's interested in starting up a YouTube channel, this is the perfect starting point for you. You can set up now for free by clicking on the link in the description or scanning the QR code that's on the screen. All right, now let's get back to the topic at hand. The footage that's coming out is pretty shocking, to say the least. The Ukrainian forces left a trail of destruction in their attack, and the key town of Sudza has been severely damaged. There are also videos of Ukrainian soldiers ripping down Russian flags and replacing them with Ukrainian ones. What goes around comes around, I suppose. Also, people are filming themselves in cars leaving the Kursk border region. They are seeing burnt-out military vehicles on the streets. Ukraine has sent some of its most elite and well-equipped divisions to the region, who could be there to stay. Zelensky reportedly wants to create a buffer zone there and keep it until both sides sign a peace deal. This buffer zone will protect the city of Sumy, near Kursk, which is a place that Russians have been eyeing for months. Since the start of the summer, the wider Sumy region has suffered 2,000 strikes, including 250 glide bombs. An incoming Russian attack in Sumy was widely expected, until Ukraine just went ahead and flipped the script on them. On top of this, Ukraine is also putting Russia between a rock and a hard place. It trapped a battalion of Russian troops south of Sumy by destroying 3 bridges that can be used to supply the troops. Important to note is that this battalion is outside the Ukrainian-controlled regions of Kursk, but it's still very hard to supply them because of geography. You see, the safest way to supply the battalion here is just to send supplies from a safe territory across the bridge. But Ukraine has destroyed all 3 bridges on the river. Now, the issue Russia is facing is that there's a high likelihood that Ukrainian forces will march on the troops stuck on the other side of the river, and there's no easy way for Russia to supply their necessary resources. Now, soldiers can just give up their position and go across the river, but can Putin afford to lose even more Russian land? With all of this in mind, there's still a chance that Putin gets out of this unscattered. That's because he is shown to be a master at manipulating public opinion. He has probably lost the support of several hundreds of thousands of citizens, maybe even more. But through his control over the state media and Russia's censorship machine, he's trying to do some damage control. This tactic has kept him in power for decades now, basically lying to his own citizens so they never actually know the true reality. The idea of the propaganda is very simple. Putin wants to make Ukraine look as bad as possible and Russia as perfect as can be. Ukraine is ringing the bells, claiming that Russia is trying to accuse it of false war crimes in Kursk. The news site Russia Today has already been caught spreading these allegations. Meanwhile, Russian media are doing their best to make the Ukrainian invasion seem like a questionable move. For example, the TASS news agency mentions huge Ukrainian losses at the top of their coverage. It claims that more than 4,400 Ukrainian servicemen have been destroyed. It also mentioned huge destruction of equipment. The claims are 65 tanks, 27 infantry fighting vehicles, 53 armored personnel carriers, 316 armored fighting vehicles, and 133 motor vehicles. And that's just the vehicles. It also said that 31 artillery units, 5 anti-aircraft systems, and 6 electronic warfare stations were annihilated. The most expensive losses it claims were 3 HIMARS rocket systems and 1 MLRS rocket system. That would make this a very costly operation. But I wouldn't trust these figures at all. In wars like this, both sides usually spread false information to boost morale and public opinion. Another piece of false information that Russian media are publishing is alleged NATO involvement. It said that the alliance played a key role in planning the Kursk attack. Now, it could be the case that the Russian intelligence is right, and that we're being lied to by NATO. But perhaps it's more likely that Putin pushes the story in order to make the West look like an evil and aggressive enemy of Russia. In their propaganda efforts, the Russian media have also been reporting a lot about the advances in the Donbass. Recently, for example, the Russian TASS news agency said that the town of Zhelanya was liberated in Donetsk. You can replace liberated with annexed, though, because Russia illegally declared Donetsk to be a republic separate from Ukraine. Further down the article, it claimed that there were nearly 500 Ukrainian casualties in the fight. While this is far from an objective source, it's not a complete lie. The Russian military has been making steady gains in the area over the past weeks, not in the least because Ukrainian personnel have pulled out of the area to fight in Kursk. But the thing is that the state media are using this to drive attention away from the Kursk front. Conveniently, these articles don't mention that the Ukrainian advances in Kursk are happening at a much faster pace than the Russian ones in the Donbass. One of the most telling public statements in the propaganda campaign thus far has been this one, though. Putin has compared the Kursk invasion to the Beslan school massacre from 20 years earlier. For those of you who don't know what this was, it's basically Russia's version of 9/11. Islamic terrorists had captured a school, and ultimately hundreds died, including many children. However, the Russian government received a lot of criticism for how it handled the situation. Survivors and family of those who died said that the Russian forces had used excessive force. Some of them even claimed that the Russian military sparked the shootout that ultimately killed hundreds of innocent civilians. They used tanks and rockets and flamethrowers in the rescue operation, which created an extremely dangerous situation. As the head of state, Putin was ultimately the one calling the shots here. Why I'm telling you this story is this. Putin was able to save face, which he did through lying and spinning the truth. He flat out ignored Russia's own failures, as did the state media. He also managed to flip the narrative to create an us versus them sentiment. Putin said that it's a dangerous world out there, with lots of people out to hurt Russian civilians. His most memorable quote after the terrorist attack was this: "We showed ourselves to be weak, and the weak get beaten." This was a call for more patriotism and a stronger state, because to Putin's logic, that would make Russia a whole lot safer. Fast forward 20 years, and he tries to push the same narrative with the Kursk invasion. Putin wants to rally against the invading force, which he accuses of being Nazis and war criminals. He's also doubling down on the war effort, claiming that the Russian state needs even more strength to protect itself. But there's one massive hole in his propaganda now. The fact that Russia's Kursk defenses were too weak is Putin's own problem. In his very own words, the weak get beaten. But that applies to Putin himself. As the head of state, he is responsible for Russia's security. Also, the Kursk invasion wouldn't have happened if he made some different decisions. He was the one who started the war, or the special military operation, as he likes to call it. We now know that he has greatly underestimated the military strength of Ukraine. The big question is if he'll get away with these mistakes. He was able to do this with the Beslan school crisis, but now it's a lot harder. This is because of something else that Putin conveniently leaves out of his messaging to the Russian public. The Kursk invasion has the potential to change the course of the war, and in a bad way for Russia. We've already discussed some of Ukraine's strategies in the previous video on Kursk, but there are some new and important developments. The latest reports are that Ukraine is strengthening its positions in Kursk, and that it has no intent on leaving. The Ukrainian Foreign Ministry said that it didn't want to take territory, but that it wouldn't back down until there was a just peace with Russia. This completely breaks down Putin's current strategy. He wanted to slowly tire out the Ukrainian military and its NATO backers until they agreed to some peace agreements where the West gets the short end of the stick. The most important elements for him are the regions in Ukraine that he has declared to be independent. These include Donetsk and Luhansk, as well as Kherson and Zaporizhia. With Ukraine's hold on parts of Kursk, however, Putin can't have the upper hand anymore. Both him and Zelensky know that he is forced to prioritize Russian lands above anything else. If this Kursk occupation goes on for weeks, or even months, it will be a nightmare scenario for Putin. The combination of an angry population in Russia, together with failing military tactics, is toxic. People in Russia had to bear a real cost for the conflict in Ukraine. 500,000 Russian military-aged men have been wounded or killed. The reason that this hasn't caused mass protests yet is pretty simple. People still believe that these sacrifices are necessary to defend the motherland. But there's a flip side to this. Losing the war, or having nothing to show for it, is absolutely unacceptable in the public's eye. A long Ukrainian occupation in Kursk could lead to exactly that. As long as Putin hasn't regained the Russian territories in Kursk, he has failed in his mission to protect Russia. And if he is forced into an unfavorable peace agreement, he has nothing to show for the 500,000 casualties. It's hard to assess what the risks for Putin are right now. Many Russians are still loyal to him. For example, people who fled from a captured village in Kursk addressed "Dear Putin" to ask for help. They talked about how their homes were ruined and how they left everything behind. Still, they had said that they supported the war their husbands and neighbors were fighting. These citizens clearly still have faith in their leader. But there are also people who say that the creatures from the administration are lying and are only out to save themselves. Only time will tell what will rise to the surface if the Kursk situation doesn't improve. Certainly, the group of people who lose their confidence in their leader will only grow. Worst-case scenario includes mass strikes or protests all over the country. After all, the thing that a dictator is most afraid of is his own population.